we will be looking at the practical application of blood gas analysis in neonates. So we have different settings where we do the blood gas analysis in clinical situations. The scalp pH can be measured during intrapartum monitoring where there is abnormal cardiotochographs. The cord blood gas is done as an indication of the condition at birth. And in any sick baby, we do the blood gas as part of the initial assessment. In ventilated babies, we use the blood gas analysis to guide ongoing changes and treatment changes in the ventilation. And we also use the gas as a tool to assess the need for mechanical ventilation. So it's used as a tool to monitor the response to treatment measures like volume replacement and correction of acidosis, as well as a guide to fluid and electrolyte management, especially if you have electrolytes added in your blood gas. So remember that this is one way to use a smaller volume to reduce your bloodletting and blood losses. In terms of cord pH, it's not routinely required in all the deliveries. However, where you have fetal compromise or the baby comes out in a poor condition, you do need to request it. And double clamping of the cord as a routine will allow you to take the sample even after the baby is delivered. So if you take the sample within 3 to 5 minutes of delivery in the double clamp segment, it will be reflective of the fetal condition at birth. The pH of less than 7.2 is not uncommon, and less than 7.1 needs evaluation. However, less than 7 is worrying and needs close monitoring. Not every baby with the cord pH less than 7 will have HIE. The lower the pH is, the higher the risk. You can refer to my talk on perinatal asphyxia, which is available on the channel as well, where I discuss that less than 6.8 cord pH is associated with HIE in more than 60% of the time, and less than 7 cord pH, it's only about 10 to 15% of the time that you have HIE. However, the baby has gone through a significant acidosis, and so evaluation and monitoring is important, especially the diving reflex could have protected the brain, and you need to look at renal compromise and so on. In terms of neonatal assessment, all sick babies would need a IV cannula insertion. So you have a cannula insertion usually as a first step when you assess the baby. You do a blood sugar, and a blood gas can be part of that as well because it gives you valuable information. A venous sample is not as accurate because the carbon dioxide is going to be higher, and because the carbon dioxide is higher, the pH also is lower. So the carbonic acid content is more, so the pH will drop. So you should evaluate that keeping these 2 points in mind. And the PO2, of course, you would not look at the venous gas for PO2 at all. And because your carbon dioxide is high, the pH is low, the bicarbonate is interpreted from that by the Hasselbalch-Henderson equation. So that is going to reflect this change as well. So always have a correction. The pH of the pH may come down by 0.03 to 0.05 in the venous sample. And in a poorly perfused child, this may be worse. The carbon dioxide again may be 10 centimeter of water higher sometimes. If it is reasonably normal, you can avoid immediate repeat sample. However, if it is abnormal, do not make decisions based on the venous sample, and you should repeat an arterial or a capillary sample before you make a decision to ventilate or correct the acidosis and so on. So the venous gas is like a baseline on which you can decide the overall condition. If it's normal, it's okay. If it's abnormal, you need to repeat to confirm with the appropriate sample. A capillary sample with a warm heel is fairly reliable, and in most babies, once you lose the arterial line, that's the only option we have. The warming of the heel should be stressed on, and you shouldn't burn the heel, obviously. Arterialization of the capillary, we call it, and even then the PO2 is not going to be reliable because it will be lower. Avoid using paraffin before you take the gas. It can damage the machine as well. Train staff both in the exact position of sampling, avoid the central part of the heel, as well as to avoid squeezing. When you squeeze, when you don't allow it to relax fully to fill up, it will cause more blood gas abnormality. Take blood gas sample first if possible when there is a free flow. The Lancet device should be used with a depth less than 1 millimeter. So this is the reflection of the area where you do it. So the shaded area is where you prefer to do it. In a baby with repeated punctures, you can come a little more medially, but avoid the areas of the medial plantar nerve and artery, and avoid going deep. So a deep lancet may cause calcaneal osteomyelitis. So 1 millimeter is the depth you go, and you have preterm lancets with 0.7 millimeter and term lancets with 1 to 1.2 millimeters. So you shouldn't exceed that. And this is the recommended position for you. So when you move this thumb up, obviously the foot will move forward and allow the blood to fill again. And you gently squeeze, don't cause so much pressure as you cause bruising in the heel or in the toes. So be careful not to obstruct the arterial flow, because you need the continuous perfusion for the capillary to be bleeding. Don't hold too tightly. If it doesn't bleed well, rewarm the heel well and then try again. Arterial sample is the ideal sample for all assessments. It is the most invasive of these methods, as arteries are major vessels. If you have an umbilical arterial catheter, it's ideal for the initial period, especially in babies who are sick, those who have pulmonary hypertension, those who are having therapeutic hypothermia, where capillary samples are very difficult, and in the extreme preterm babies who will stay ventilated for a period of time, significant fluctuations in the blood pressure. So these babies, invasive PP monitoring is ideal. And peripheral arterial catheters are not routinely used in most units. However, in the very sick babies, like we discussed, if you don't have an arterial line, you may have to insert a peripheral arterial catheter. Don't forget to assess for the end organ perfusion. For example, if you're using the radial or ulnar artery, you need to do the Allen's test and confirm that the flow is good from the opposite side. There is always a risk of spasm and gangrene, so keep evaluating the fingertips or the toe tips so you don't have risk of gangrene. So the condition of the baby is important. If you are pricking the baby immediately and it's not through an arterial line, then the baby may have pain, and hyperventilation affects the carbon dioxide and so on. The perfusion may drop as well, especially if the baby has labile pulmonary pressures. The pulmonary hypertension may drop the PaO2 as well. So it's better to have a line in place for a very sick baby, and if you don't have a line, use comforting measures or oral sucrose, for example, to reduce the pain when you're sampling. The suction has an effect on sampling, but it is overrated. However, if you're planning a timed sample in your unit for a ventilated baby, always do the suction before you sample if there is a suction planned. Suction is a separate topic on ventilation, which I will cover later, but we don't recommend routine suctioning or timed suctioning in most situations. But if it is a small tube, you do need at least one suction per shift or two suctions per shift. The smaller the tube, because you don't want tube blockage as well. And once the tube starts crusting, it's really difficult to remove those secretions. So 1 or 2 times suctions per shift is reasonable, and you don't do suction with every care. For example, if you feel there is noise, it's a very poor reflection, because you need to allow the secretions to persist in the airway for a long time before you can hear the conducted sounds increasing. So if you're planning to do the suction, do it first before you sample, because then you take a blood sample for the gas, you see that the carbon dioxide is high, and then you wonder, could it be because of secretions, and you suction and you repeat the sample again, which is a wasted effort. So discuss with your team and time it appropriately. About 15 to 20 minutes after the suction is enough time for the equilibration to happen. Same way, every ventilator setting change doesn't need a blood gas unless the previous gas was significantly abnormal and the change you're making is difficult to predict. You may need, of course, you can follow the flow and loop curves, you can follow the effort of breathing, you can follow the FiO2 changes to guide you. And if you have made a major change, of course, you need a gas to document. Air contamination and dropback sample contamination we discussed earlier, that heparin may cause increased acidosis, overinterpretation of acidosis. Air contamination will increase the PO2 in the lower levels and drop it in the higher levels, and CO2 contamination will drop the CO2. If you delay in assessing the sample as well, you may have concerns. So I am very much in favor of minimizing interventions, and we will have a future lecture on minimizing interventions in neonatology as a whole. But in general terms, our idea should be not to intervene frequently. Think about whether you definitely need a particular sample. Cluster your care, cluster your sampling. Suppose you're taking a blood gas, take other samples that you may plan at the same time. At the same time, don't overdo sampling just because you're handling the catheter. Only do what is needed for the baby at that time, because sampling losses are one of the main reasons why these babies get anemic, and anemia cannot be ignored. Reducing the number of transfusions the baby gets is very important as well. If you have the baseline parameters, the response to further changes can be made based on the available factors which we discussed earlier. Request the blood gas only when essential. For example, if a baby is on CPAP, their breathing effort is good, they are on room air, and there is really no need to do blood gases on them to know they are stable. By weaning the pressure and looking at the chest wall in drawing, you know how the baby is coping with it. If there is worsening to an extent where the baby has recurrent apneic episodes and you're thinking whether the baby is decompensating and may need mechanical ventilation, then you need to do a blood gas. Even there, it's more often a clinical decision if the baby is tiring out, because even if the blood gas is normal, if the baby has multiple apneic episodes, it means the baby is not coping and you do need to intervene. So you can do a blood gas along with other samples for septic screen, etc. in such a baby who is decompensating. But in a stable baby, you can assess the blood gas once in 2-3 days along with the electrolyte assessments as you need them. You don't need a routine blood gas in babies on high flow as well. So plan your blood sampling. In a ventilated baby, as I said, if you make a change which is very significant, you do need to document the response to it. If you're correcting the acidosis in a baby with shock, you do need to follow it up. And you do have to consider the medico-legal implications of delaying a blood gas in a baby where it is indicated. So you try to minimize interventions in a safe way. So you do document when it is important, like a pH which is abnormal, and you are doing measures to correct it. You have to have a reasonable length of time within which you should do the repeat gas. In terms of mechanical ventilation, we have different parameters we are looking at. So the pH, there is an impact of multiple factors. It's not just the ventilation, it's also the perfusion, not only in the lungs, but also in the peripheral circulation. So ventilation itself may compromise your peripheral perfusion by affecting cardiac filling and circulation. So please remember that you may be overdoing the ventilation. If the CO2 is low and your capillary filling is prolonged and your base excess is increasing, that means it's because of over distension. BPD is related to barotrauma and volute trauma. Please don't overdo ventilation. Your aim of ventilation is to support the baby in a physiological manner, to tide over their problem. You're not going to overdo, and overdoing often is an important problem in medicine. You also have to assess the fluid balance, whether you restrict fluids if there is a PDA, whether you want to give more fluid if the baby looks dry. Role of acetating TPN can be considered in the extreme preterms, and of course there is a physiologic bicarbonate loss, and we discussed that earlier. So the goals of ventilation are to maintain the oxygenation and effective ventilation with maintaining PCO2 levels. We should minimize the work of breathing and optimize the outcome. We should avoid both short and long-term complications. So we discussed all this during the series on ventilation, and I would quickly run through this, but the factors related to blood gas is how you interpret. So in terms of PCO2, we should avoid hypocapnia at any cost, because hypocapnia reduces your peripheral perfusion. There is a risk of periventricular leukomalacia and neurodevelopmental abnormality as a result of prolonged hypocapnia. So the number of times a baby gets hypocapnic, the duration to which the baby is hypocapnic, these are important. We should also remember that the pulmonary vessels constrict when there is hypoxia, hypercapnia and acidemia. So these are parameters we should avoid, especially in a sick newborn baby when the pulmonary pressures are still labile. And when there is pulmonary hypertension, previously we used to overventilate to wash out CO2, but we don't do that anymore, because anything that you're overdoing damages the lung more, and you're flogging the lung unnecessarily to get a low CO2, which is a very temporary effect. So if you support the baby by alternative means, you will reach the same effect. So we still maintain the CO2 in the lower side of normal. You shouldn't wash out CO2 with overventilation. This applies very importantly for babies with diaphragmatic hernia as well, where you accept a slightly lower pH, you accept a slightly high PCO2 when you want to avoid overdoing ventilation. So the high carbon dioxide tension with elevated hydrogen ion concentration increases the extracellular calcium influx, which is thought to be the main cause of vasoconstriction in the pulmonary circulation. So this is about the hypocapnia. In terms of hypercapnia, most of us from the time we trained, when I was training like early 1990s, permissive hypercapnia was already in vogue, and the extent to which you do permissive hypercapnia is what is debated. A very high PCO2 in the first week of life in an extreme preterm can increase risk of IVH because it causes cerebral vasodilation. This is in a baby where the autoregulation is not well controlled as well, so we should be careful, especially if there is asphyxia. Hypercapnia is not encouraged. because the autoregulation is going to be bad in these babies. The Felby trials by Thom et al. And other studies did not show that aggressive use of permissive hypercapnia offered significant benefits in improving BPD or other outcomes. There is, of course, a potential higher risk of complications due to which the Felby trial was stopped early. So they used a target range in the high target group of 55 to 65 millimeter on days 1 to 3, going up to 60 to 70 on days 4 to 6, and 65 to 75 on days 7 to 14. And the control group was 40 to 50 on days 1 to 3, 45 to 55 on days 4 to 6. So this is between permissive hypercapnia and more aggressive permissive hypercapnia. So here in the control group itself, we do have permissive hypercapnia, which most of us use. And remember that these are different if you use capillary samples, because capillary CO2 is going to be higher than the arterial CO2 by 3 to 5 millimeter of mercury. So the message here is that you can have permissive hypercapnia to a reasonable degree. Be careful in the first 3 days. Be careful in asphyxiated babies, so better to keep them in the normal range. And even in PPHN, you don't want hypocapnia, and you also want to avoid hypercapnia. You want the CO2 in the 35 to 40 millimeter range. So this is a quick diagram to show you the impact. Suppose your blood gas shows hypercapnia and your oxygen requirements are rising. That means you need to increase the mean airway pressure by any of these measures. You can increase peak inspiratory pressure, and if the lung volume is closed down, the PEEP increase will help you recruit the lung volume, and so it may actually paradoxically improve the CO2 as well. But anything that improves the delta P will improve the CO2, and increasing the PEEP on its own in a well-distended lung may actually improve only the oxygenation. It may not improve the CO2. So the oxygenation can be impacted by the FiO2 and anything that increases the mean airway pressure, which is the shaded area under the curve, which can be increase in the PIP, increase in the PEEP, and change in the IE ratio, where you increase the inspiration, and change in the flow, where square wave will cause a more quick inflation of the lung. So this is a square wave caused by increasing flow, and a sine wave when the flow is a bit slower. So a steep rise will increase the area under the curve. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, it's tidal volume times rate, and so anything that increases the minute ventilation will increase the carbon dioxide washout. So increasing in the PIP and increasing in the rate are the mainstay when it comes to CO2 removal. So changes in the PIP affect both PaO2 and PaCO2 by effects on tidal volume and MAP. The high PIP may increase the risk of volute trauma, so be careful when you make changes. Make only essential changes. The adequacy is checked by inflation, and you consider doing a blood gas. You don't need a blood gas for every single change you do, but it's a good practice. If the changes were significant, you repeat to the blood gas. If the previous gas was significantly abnormal, you do need to check again. The positive end expiratory pressure prevents alveolar collapse. It maintains the lung volume at end expiration and improves VQ mismatch. Increased PEEP improves the MAP and improves the FRC, thus it improves oxygenation. In a closed down lung, increasing the PEEP by improving the FRC improves carbon dioxide washout as well. So this is an important concept in the acute phase of the disease. So PEEP increase doesn't always lead to CO2 retention. You need an adequate PEEP to open the lungs well before you can consider other changes. If disproportionately high PEEP is used, you get over distension causing CO2 retention. And we discussed about the impact on the venous return cardiac output, and also the iatrogenic pulmonary hypertension due to increased pulmonary vascular resistance. Your lung blood vessels are also compressed, so you're actually worsening the situation by over distending. So increase in PIP, increasing in PEEP beyond a certain degree are both important in causing these iatrogenic problems, which we should avoid at all costs. The rate, obviously, we use a slightly higher ventilatory rate, and we discussed that in the ventilation series. I'm not repeating it. However, remember that rate adjustments are important for carbon dioxide. And also remember that in high frequency, increasing the rate is one of the measures we use when you have CO2 washout. And if you have CO2 retention, you drop the rate on high frequency to make your ventilation more effective. When I say rate on high frequency, it's a frequency, sorry. In the management of sick babies, blood gas is important to evaluate shock and its management. Lactate is a very important tool. Those of you who do PICU they use lactate a much greater level than in the NICU. However, in an asphyxiated baby or in a baby in shock or in a post-operative baby, lactate is a very important tool. Many surgeons use lactate as a tool in necrotizing enterocolitis as well. The response to treatment can be assessed based on improvement in pH and lactate levels. The need for fluid replacement, blood transfusion, etc. can be assessed based on blood gas readings as well. So the pH and the base excess are going to be the key here. And obviously, if the CO2 is rising in a child with shock, you should take over the effort of breathing by ventilating them. So be aggressive in shock management, ventilate them. And echocardiography role is very important. And recently we have NIRS as a measure of VO2, which is systemic circulation and in the brain vessels, and comparing them may give you an indication of how to correct the shock. As clinical examples before we close, so this is a baby where the pH is 7.18, PCO2 is 55, PO2 is 60, bicarbonate is 13, and base excess is -11. So when we interpret the blood gas, we look at whether it is acidosis or alkalosis, and this is obviously acidosis. Then we look at the direction of the change. The carbon dioxide is high, so it is respiratory acidosis. The bicarbonate is low, it is metabolic acidosis. So this is a mixed picture, and a mixed picture is not uncommon in babies because they are sick babies where you have a lung disease, and the lung disease is leading to metabolic problems due to poor perfusion, poor oxygenation, and so on. So this is a typical picture we get in a baby with respiratory distress syndrome, for example. So it's not a single direction change. There is no compensation here because the child is too unwell. And if the CO2 continues rising, or if the baby is in a high oxygen requirement, you'd make the decision to give surfactant for this baby if it's a preterm baby with respiratory distress. If the same happens with the term baby with meconium aspiration, your approach would be to support the ventilation, correct the carbon dioxide. The perfusion may improve on its own. So the bicarbonate is usually a secondary response to the oxygenation difficulty. The PO2 obviously depends on the FiO2. I didn't tell you what the FiO2 was, and if the PO2 is disproportionately low compared to the FiO2, it means there is the AADO2 ratio is affected, so obviously the lung is diseased. So this is a baby, a preterm baby with respiratory distress syndrome, and based on this gas and the work of breathing as well as oxygen requirement being close to 40%, we decided to give surfactant. Because the base deficit was high, we kept the baby on ventilator for 2 to 3 hours. We repeated a gas. When the perfusion improved and the acidosis improved, we extubated the baby. So these babies are probably not good candidates for the LISA or MIST, but you can do it if the baby clinically looks stable. So in this example, we have the same pH. The PCO2 is 64 and the bicarbonate is normal. So this is more respiratory acidosis. Depending on the condition of the baby, you decide to support either with CPAP or with ventilation. The baby is still compensated, and the correction will start over time because the metabolic compensation takes time. The respiratory compensation is quicker. So same pH can have different pictures, and the same gas, according to the condition of the baby, according to the story, your interventions will differ. I'm not giving you a lot of examples because each case is different, but the main things is how to interpret and how to look at the summary of the whole case. You have to look at the perfusion of the baby, you have to look at the fluid volume, fluid balance of the baby, you have to look at infection as a consideration, and you have to correct the ventilatory support as needed. And in a very sick baby, you have to take over the breathing, the mechanical ventilation, because tiring out and the effort of breathing and everything will add to the sickness. So to summarize, blood gas measurement is a very important tool in NICU care. A sound understanding of the basics is important in deciding what to do, when to do the blood gas, and how to act based on the results. So I hope it's useful, and thank you for being here. And